bombs continue to fall on Gaza. Tens of thousands are dead. Parents claw through rubble to find their children. Others carry dead bodies to shallow graves. In the West Bank, rage simmers as Israeli settlers march in without fear. Politicians talk of security and terror, but underneath the dust and blood, a deeper truth whispers. This nightmare has roots more than 100 years old. To uncover them, we have to roll back to the First World War, to a Britain on the brink of collapse, desperate to hold its empire together and willing to gamble with promises that would ignite a century of conflict. The story doesn't begin in Jerusalem or Gaza. It begins in London in the year 1914. The Great War had erupted, and Britain quickly realized this wasn't going to be easy. The Ottoman Empire, branded the sick man of Europe, had joined Germany. Suddenly, the Suez Canal, Britain's lifeline to India, was at risk. For Britain, losing Suez meant the empire's arteries would be cut open. So, the men in Whitehall looked east. It needed allies, it needed influence, it needed a plan. And that plan? A web of double-dealing promises that would become one of the greatest diplomatic deceptions of the 20th century. In the desert of the Hejaz, Sharif Hussein of Mecca commanded respect as the custodian of Islam's holiest cities. He wasn't blind to the Ottoman decline. He dreamed of an independent Arab kingdom stretching from Aleppo to Aden. And Britain saw an opportunity. Enter Sir Henry McMahon, the British High Commissioner in Egypt. From 1915 to 1916, McMahon exchanged letters with Hussein, the now infamous Hussein-McMahon correspondence. In a set of carefully chosen, deliberately ambiguous words, McMahon dangled a prize. If the Arabs rose against the Ottomans, Britain would support their independence after the war. And Hussein took the bait. In June 1916, the Arab revolt erupted. Camel-mounted warriors stormed deserts with British rifles and gold. British propaganda spun it into a romantic epic, later immortalized as Lawrence of Arabia. But here is the truth. To Britain, Hussein's men were mere pawns, not partners. The letters, written with deliberate vagueness, had left Palestine's fate in the shadows. Hussein believed Palestine was included in his promised kingdom, but Britain thought otherwise. The seeds of betrayal were planted. And even as Hussein fought for his dream of Arab freedom, Britain was sketching a very different future with another ally. While McMahon wooed Hussein, another conversation was unfolding in secret rooms. Britain could not redraw the Middle East map alone. France had its own ambitions, especially in Syria and Lebanon. So in 1916, Mark Sykes of Britain and François-Georges Picot of France drew their notorious map. The Sykes-Picot agreement carved up Ottoman lands like slices of a pie. France would take Syria and Lebanon. Britain would claim Iraq and Palestine, ignoring the promise to Sharif Hussein. The Arabs, who were bleeding and dying for independence, weren't even told. The betrayal was sealed in ink. The second promise, to France, directly contradicted the first. Britain had promised Palestine to Sharif Hussein and the Arabs. Then it cut a deal with the French, keeping the territory for itself. But the double game didn't stop there. A third deal was coming and this one would change the region forever. Among Britain's Jewish population and across Europe, Zionism was gaining momentum. Led by figures like Theodor Herzl and Chaim Weizmann, it called for a Jewish homeland in Palestine. By the time war raged in Europe, Zionism was no longer a fringe idea, it was an organized political force. Weizmann, a Russian-born chemist living in Manchester, proved invaluable. His invention of a process to produce acetone, which is crucial for making explosives, had won him friends in high places. But his true skill was lobbying. He persuaded British politicians that supporting Zionism would serve their interests. Why would Britain care about a Jewish homeland in Palestine? The reasons were strategic. British leaders, including Prime Minister David Lloyd George and Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour, saw advantages on multiple fronts. First, they believed it would rally Jewish support for the war, especially in the United States and Russia, where Jewish influence was thought to be significant. Second, they calculated that a pro-British Jewish homeland in Palestine would act as a buffer, protecting the Suez Canal and British routes to India. Third, anti-Semitic stereotypes played their part. British officials exaggerated the world power of Jewish financiers and media, imagining that a declaration in favor of Zionism would buy global influence. It was a fantasy, but one they acted upon. And so, in the autumn of 1917, Britain prepared its third promise. On 2nd November 1917, Foreign Secretary Arthur James Balfour wrote a short letter to Lord Rothschild, a leader of the British Jewish community. The letter was only 67 words long, but it would change the Middle East forever. It read, "His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine." It was a masterpiece of ambiguity. National home was never defined. The promise to protect non-Jewish communities, then 90% of the Palestinian population, was vague. But the political message was clear. Britain now officially endorsed Zionism. For Zionists, it was a triumph. Weizmann wept when he read the letter. For Arabs, it was a betrayal of breathtaking scale. For Britain, it was yet another promise piled on top of two others. One land, three masters, and a fire that would never die. And just weeks later, that fire would burn brighter as British boots marched into Jerusalem. General Edmund Allenby took over Jerusalem on December 11, 1917. He entered the old city on foot, a symbolic act of humility. The city had fallen without destruction, but its fate was already entangled in Britain's diplomatic web. Allenby's capture of Jerusalem electrified the Christian world. In London, church bells rang, and newspapers declared it a Christmas gift to the British people. For Zionists, it seemed a divine sign that their homeland was within reach. For Arabs, who had fought side by side with Britain, the truth was sinking in. They had been deceived. The betrayal would become undeniable in the years to come. The ink was barely dry on the Balfour Declaration when Britain's grand juggling act began to collapse. Because the moment the war ended, the promises Britain had scattered would collide on the grandest stage of all, Paris. On the ground, trouble was brewing. Arab fighters, led by Sharif Hussein's sons Faisal and Abdullah, had fought shoulder to shoulder with the British against the Ottomans. They expected a revolt. Instead, they began to suspect betrayal. At Versailles Peace Conference in 1919, Faisal arrived as the Arab voice of liberation. Draped in flowing robes, he cut an exotic figure in the gilded halls of Paris. By his side was T. E. Lawrence, desperately trying to convince his own government not to abandon the Arabs. But Faisal soon discovered he was a minor player in a great power game. Britain and France had already carved up the Middle East in the Sykes-Picot deal. Palestine was to be placed under international administration, a polite phrase which essentially meant colonial control. Faisal's dream of an Arab kingdom collapsed. Meanwhile, Zionist leaders like Weizmann lobbied relentlessly, reminding the Allies of the national home Britain had promised. To Britain, already committed on paper, this was an obligation it could not wriggle out of without international embarrassment. But while Versailles staged its theatre of diplomacy, another report, half a world away, was quietly warning of the disaster to come. In the same year, US President Woodrow Wilson sent a commission to Palestine to gauge local opinion. He appointed Oberlin College President Henry C. King and Chicago businessman Charles A. Crane to determine the attitudes of the inhabitants of Syria and Palestine about the post-World War settlement of their territories. The findings were explosive. Palestinians overwhelmingly rejected Zionism. They demanded independence, not immigration. The King-Crane report put forth a warning. Forcing a Jewish homeland against the will of the local population would mean serious danger of violence. But the report was quietly buried in Washington. London and Paris ignored it. Realpolitik mattered more than the voices of Jaffa and Jerusalem. In April 1920, at San Remo, Britain got mandates over Palestine and Iraq. France got Syria and Lebanon. The mandate system was an authorization granted by the League of Nations to a member country to govern a former German or Turkish colony. The territory was called a mandated territory or mandate. In effect, the Arab lands were divided into European colonies with League of Nations rubber stamps. Britain's mandate over Palestine incorporated the Balfour Declaration word for word. Zionism now had international legitimacy. For the Arabs, the betrayal was now official, and the anger was about to spill onto the streets of Jerusalem. So Jerusalem erupted. During the Nabi Musa festival, crowds turned violent. Arabs, furious at betrayal, clashed with Jews. Deaths, injuries, blood on the streets. Britain cracked down with bayonets and prisons, but the message was clear. Violence had now entered the story. The years 1917 to 1920 planted every seed of the conflict to come. Britain had tied itself into knots. 3 promises, 1 land, and no way out. The following decades unrolled like an unstoppable chain reaction. Britain, trapped by its own words, faced mounting unrest. Jewish immigration surged, fueled by rising anti-Semitism in Europe, especially the Holocaust unleashed by Hitler and the Nazis. Arabs rebelled, insisting they had been betrayed. London deployed troops, commissions, and white papers, but nothing worked. By 1947, exhausted, Britain handed the problem to the newly formed United Nations. The UN voted to partition Palestine into Jewish and Arab states. The Jewish leadership accepted, but the Arab world rejected. When Israel declared independence in 1948, war broke out. All surrounding Arab countries declared war against Israel, but the trained Jewish army prevailed. For Jews, it was the birth of a homeland. For Palestinians, it was the Nakba, the catastrophe. Hundreds of thousands fled or were expelled from their villages. Refugee camps sprang up across the Middle East. The King-Crane Commission's warning now rang true. Violence on a scale unimaginable had arrived. But 1948 was not the end. It was only the beginning of a deeper occupation. In 6 days of war in 1967, from June 5th to 10th, Israel seized the West Bank and East Jerusalem from Jordan, Gaza Strip and Sinai from Egypt, and the Golan Heights from Syria. Israel later made peace with Egypt by returning Sinai. But for Palestinians, the loss was total. They were left under occupation, stateless and voiceless. Occupation hardened, resistance followed. Palestinian uprisings, the Intifadas of 1987 and 2000, brought stones and suicide bombings against tanks and helicopters. The 1990s brought the Oslo Accords, promising peace. But on the ground, more checkpoints, more settlements, more despair. Now, more than a century after the Balfour Declaration, Gaza lies in ruins from war after war. The West Bank is carved by walls and settlements. Britain's 67-word declaration, drafted in the corridors of power in 1917, echoes across every demolished building, every refugee camp, every family torn apart. In 1917, Arthur Balfour believed he was writing a clever line in Britain's imperial playbook. He could not have foreseen that those words, a national home for the Jewish people, would ignite a century of bloodshed. Today, as rockets fall on Gaza and bulldozers reshape the West Bank, the ghosts of 1917 to 1920 walk beside us. Britain's attempt to promise one land to two peoples remains the original sin of the modern Middle East.